Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. If you're hearing this, then you're on the private feed because you support the show, and you will never have to hear ads. So first things first, thank you so much for your support. My guest today is David Shor. David Shor is a political data scientist. He worked for the Obama campaign and was described in New York Magazine as Obama's in-house Nate Silver. You may know David's name because he was fired in June over a tweet that was widely viewed as innocent. The tweet cited research showing that riots, unlike nonviolent protests, tend to move voters to the right. I wanted to talk to David about the circumstances of his firing, but for legal reasons, David can't talk about it publicly. Fortunately, he is an extremely interesting person outside of his cancellation, and he's the perfect person to talk to about the lessons of the 2020 election. David was really a joy to talk to and a fountain of information, and I recommend you all follow him on Twitter. We talk about the basics of polling. We talk about why the polls underpredicted Trump's performance in both 2016 and 2020. We talk about David's skepticism of the so-called shy Trump voter effect. We talk about the problem of non-response bias, what to make of the growing cultural divide between college-educated and non-college-educated voters. We have a very productive disagreement about the so-called racial resentment scales used as a tool to understand why people voted for Trump. We talk about why Trump's share of the minority vote increased between 2016 and 2020. We talk about what the 2020 election has done to the idea that demography is destiny. We talk about the implications of getting rid of the Electoral College, the surprising change in how super PAC money affects politics, how the protests and riots affected public opinion, and we talk about the future of Trumpism without Trump. One final note here. David's job has been to get Democrats elected. So he is a partisan, not in the pejorative sense of the word, just in the descriptive sense. I say this only because he often uses the words we and us in this podcast to refer to the Democratic Party. And as I make clear at one point, I'm an independent, so I don't speak that way. In any event, I think Democrats would be very wise to listen to him. So without further ado, David Shor. Okay, David Shor, thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Honored to be invited.
So we have a lot to talk about, given that it's November 13th that we're speaking, just a little over a week after the election. And before we get into everything, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think you're the perfect person to help me and my audience parse what is, what we've gleaned from the election so far. What models of the American electorate turned out to be right and which turned out to be wrong, and what we can expect from the constantly shifting coalitions of the two parties going forward, and what we've learned, and what surprises and what expected results we found out a week and a half ago. But before we get to everything, can you just give people a summary of your background, how you got into the political polling and analysis and consulting work that you do?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I'd say I was really lucky. I was a math major in college, and, kind of as I was going through studying pure math, I kind of realized, I don't think that's what I want to do with my life. And this was in 2007. And so, the data science didn't really exist yet. And there was like a lot more low hanging fruit, just in terms of applying data to anything. And I was pretty into politics. So I started a blog that very, very few people ever ran. But, me and my friend, we ran it for a couple of years doing like Nate Silver style things. And then I applied to work at the Obama campaign in 2012. And then I was part of the analytics team there. I built their election forecasting system. And after that, I started the analytics team at the Obama campaign, kind of started a company called Civis Analytics. So I was I went over there with my boss and was kind of part of the founding team there. And then, Civis has played a pretty big role. I think in a lot of ways, they've been like the IBM of political data science in a lot of ways. And I worked there until earlier this year.
So before we get into the election and what we've discovered about the electorate, I want to just rehearse a few of the most basic points about polling that you probably haven't thought of in a decade, but are worth reminding people. I think many people feel like they themselves have never responded to a poll. And in view of the failed predictions of polling in 2020 and 2016, or at least the apparent failures, it might be just worth going over very simply why it's possible to learn anything of value from a poll of 500 people, say, in a country of 350 million, and maybe talk about the concept of randomization and why that's important and how pollsters achieve or fail to achieve that.
Sure. I think that I don't want to talk up polling, and we'll get into it. I think people have a lot of a right to be suspicious of polls in a lot of ways. But just to talk through statistically, this underpinning of polling is this idea that when if you call 1,000 people out of the 300 million people that are there, the underlying theory is that if you take a sample and you ask them who they're voting for, that basically, even though you're not talking to everyone, that's a lot of people, and really kind of the margin of error for talking to 1,000 people is very low. And I think, looking at it purely in that simple example, I think if you went out to a store and if you walked outside and you looked and you just kind of counted how many people there were, and you did that every single day 1,000 times, and you average the results, I think that you'd end up feeling relatively confident. And so that's kind of the idea, is just that sampling does work in theory. I would say though that I think the real problem with polling is that even though it's theoretically possible to learn a lot about a large group by talking to a small number of people, a subsample of people in a group, and that's like kind of the underpinning of like a lot of modern society. The problem is that really relies on this equal sampling assumption that you have 100 million phone numbers, and you're calling everyone, and everyone is just kind of, and everyone's chance of answering is exactly the same. You need all of that to basically be true in order for a lot of this stuff to work. And we don't live in that world. The reality is that some people are substantially more likely to pick up the phone than others, some in ways that, are very well understood. Older people pick up the phone more, women pick up the phone more, white people are more likely to answer the phone. And when you put that all together, older, white women over the age of 65 are something like 100 times more likely to answer the phone than Latino men under the age of 34. And so that's a lot of bias. And if it was just those things, we could correct for it. But it turns out that what drives people to answer phone calls or not, is driven by a whole host of factors that are very hard to control for, whether it's their trust, how nice a person, like how agreeable they are, or, how much trust do they have in the system, or it could be that they're Democrats, and Democrats are unusually enthusiastic because of the news that had happened this week. And so adjusting for all of that stuff is extremely hard. And I think that people are very reasonable. I think their intuitions that this is something that this is something that is hard, that you can just like dial a bunch of people and then say something about everyone else. I think that skepticism is founded. We do the best we can. And I think that, on average, to me, the surprising thing is that polls are ever right at all. And, I think they do have a somewhat reasonable track record. They usually get things to within, 3 or 4 points, which is nice. But it is an extremely hard thing and people mess it up all the time.
Yeah. So the polls in 2016 and 2020 both underpredicted Trump's success. So the question is why? Was the same mistake made twice? Were different mistakes made? Or is there some third explanation?
Yeah, I think it's worth decomposing what happened into two different stories. In 2016, the national polls were not particularly wrong. I think the final average was 3.4 and the final result was 2.2 in margin. So not terribly different. But on a state level, the reason why Trump's win was a surprise was because basically all of these states in the Midwest saw these giant swings toward Donald Trump that the polling didn't see coming. And I guess not just in the Midwest, really, if you look state by state, the biggest predictor is that states that had a lot of non-college educated whites, but particularly in the Midwest, or at least particularly outside the South, saw very big polling errors. But the national numbers were about right. And so in 2018, the national numbers were also about right, but the same polling errors actually occurred again. If you look, Democrats really underperformed expectations in these working class white states like Ohio or Michigan or West Virginia is the most extreme one. And then we flash forward to 2020, and this exact same set of biases happen again. People make these plots, and you can just see that really the polls were wrong in relative terms in basically exactly the same places for 3 cycles in a row. But there was another phenomena that did happen, which is that in 2020, the national polls were not just about right. The national polls were pretty wrong by historical standards. It looks like we're going to end up, with something like a Biden plus 4.5, maybe 5-point race in the national popular vote once all the votes are tallied. And that is not what the average, what the national polling average was. You can see this pretty down the line, not just in the presidency, but in the Senate and the House, where everything was roughly 2 to 3% more Republican than everyone predicted in a relatively uniform way. A little bit more in Republican states, but fairly uniform. And so you had these two things happening simultaneously, and they had a similar, but some they were two different phenomena with two different causes, but I think that in a lot of ways they come from the same phenomena. And just to talk about that, when people talk about polling error, I think people misfocus on what actually makes polls wrong. People really like to talk about turnout. They like to talk about undecided voters. They like to talk about, what we call in the industry late movement. The polls were wrong because everybody changed their mind at the last second. The undecideds broke our way, or, one side really mobilized their base and the other side didn't. And that's actually usually not why polls are wrong. All of those things are possible. Oh, and I forgot. Also, people have this shy Trump hypothesis that people are lying to pollsters. As far as we can tell, that's actually a very rare thing. It usually does not happen.
That's actually worth dwelling on for a second, because I've heard a lot of people believe that. So before you continue, what's the evidence that that's actually not the case?
There's a couple of pieces. The first is that, we can, one thing people like to do for this is they get at this social desirability is they look at, are there differences between how people answer online versus on the phone? We can re-interview people multiple times and see how consistent they are. And then the other thing is that we can match survey respondents to the voter file. And something that we can see is that really the vast majority, in the voter file, we have things like party registration. We can see donation records. What we can see is there's a very strong relationship, between what people say and what people end up doing, both in re-interviews and with external information that we have about them. The problem isn't that, Trump voters were lying. The real issue is that they just weren't picking up the phone. And that really gets to this, core problem of why polls are actually usually wrong. It gets to this thing you asked me about a couple minutes ago, which is that when you call a bunch of people, polling working is built on this idea that the people who answer the phone are the same as the people who don't answer the phone once you control for the things that you wait on. And traditionally, pollsters have really weighted, and when I say weighted, I mean, if you survey a bunch of people and the sample is 70% women because women are more likely to pick up the phone, and from the census that the population is 50% women, you kind of apply a weight to women to weight their responses down, and you weight the men up, and then things represent the overall population. And so basically, if there are things that you aren't waiting on that are influencing someone's chance of picking up the phone, and those things are correlated with who they're going to vote for, then your poll is going to be wrong. And so that's why pollsters do weighting. But historically, they've only weighted on a very small number of factors, age and race and gender. And most recently, after 2016, they started to do education. And the problem with it is it's very hard to know. When you do this process, you simultaneously have to ask people the thing or have the information on the survey respondents, but you also have to know the true value. And that's easier for gender. In the voter file, there's gender, you can do counts, or the census will tell you. But if you want to know, even for education, people with college degrees are more likely to vote than people who aren't. So even if the census tells you that 30% of people have a college degree, it's very hard to know what percentage of likely voters have a college degree. That's like a very hard problem. But as a result, pollsters have weighted on a very small number of things. And most polling error comes from when something is predicting a response that they weren't controlling for. The industry term for this is survey non-response bias. I think people find it a little non-intuitive, when I say this. But the important point is that response rates are very low now. It used to be going back to the 1940s that Gallup could call people and you would get an 80% response rate. And I think that's because the world was a lot more boring back then. So someone could, people would get a call and they go, oh my God, a researcher wants to know my views on contemporary events. And the world isn't like that anymore. Now, going into 2016, which was, the last year that, my former employer did phone calls, we were looking at 0.8% response rates. And so if you're in a world where Democrats are picking up the phone at 1.4% and Republicans are picking up at 1.1, that'll actually generate a very significant bias that'll be very hard to control for. And so that's where most of this bias comes from. And so, okay.
Just briefly, what happens when, and I think you mentioned it when we spoke before this podcast, but what happens when the responding population differs from the non-responding population on a trait that's completely invisible, but still correlated with political party, like a big five personality trait? Say people who respond are more likely to have some kind of personality, to be neurotic, and that correlates. Is there any way? Is that a permanent limitation?
Well, that's the whole problem. Then your poll is wrong, and then that's what's so horrifying about what we do, is that you really need to control for as much as you can in order, if you want your polls to be right, and that's something that's very hard. And just to talk through these two different biases, first the one that appeared in 2016, 2018, 2020, and then the second one that appeared just in 2020. The first one, after 2016, our polls were wrong just like everybody else's, and we did a lot of soul searching to try to figure out why. I think a lot of pollsters were like, oh, the polls are fine, slate movement, whatever, and we really wanted to be honest about the fact that we were wrong and that our measurement apparatus wasn't working, and so we spent a lot of time and trying to understand what went wrong. And one of the things that really came out was this idea of social trust. It turns out, that's a social science term, a little academic, but it gets operationalized in this question of, do you believe that people can generally be trusted, or do you think that people should keep to themselves? And something that we saw, and this is something that actually researchers have known for a very long time, is that people who say that people can't be trusted are substantially less likely to answer phone surveys. Or really any kind of survey. Their areas also have lower census response rates. In a lot of ways, that's very unsurprising. But that used to not matter. This bias has always existed. The question is like, why did that start making the polls be wrong in 2016? And the answer is really interesting, which is that until 2016, social trust used to not be correlated with partisanship. Once you controlled for age and education and all these other things. But then political coalitions change over time. The story of 2016 was that a very large number of non-college educated white people swung toward Republicans, and a very large number of college educated white people swung toward Democrats. And those non-college educated white people who swung against us were overwhelmingly, had much lower than average levels of social trust. And so if you look actually among non-college educated voters, non-college whites who say that people can be trusted actually swung toward Democrats slightly, while the ones who say that people can't be trusted swung heavily against us. And so public polls were surveying this like high trust universe. And as a result, were or in particular, this high trust subsample of non-college educated whites. And there's like a lot of other, trust is one dimension. There's a lot of other ways these groups are different. There are occupational divides, to being a teacher, even though you don't have a college degree, there's a big difference between being a teacher's assistant versus being a construction worker. We found that living in working in an office as opposed to not working in an office was like a very strong predictor among non-college graduates for swinging toward Trump. And so that polls were surveying this group and getting the wrong answer. And that's why these biases were the largest in these states that had the most, non-college educated whites, like the Midwest.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on the last point you made about, the different types of people that are quote unquote non-college educated. And you mentioned that if you work in an office or you're a teacher's assistant, that marks you differently in an important way than being a non-college educated construction worker. And what that says to me is, when we talk about educated versus non-college educated, we're using education as a proxy for culture, for some kind of cultural divide. And I was recently speaking to someone who, was wondering, because superficially you could see, okay, college educated whites go Democrat, non-college educated whites go Republican for Trump. Isn't it just the case that the more educated you are, the more sort of accurate a model of the country you have, the more likely you are to vote for the party that's better? I mean, that's obviously I'm an independent, but that's something a partisan might think, or just a rational person might think based on that split. But it seems to me the divide is not even really about education so much as it's about the culture that you absorb in an environment like an office, a college, or a school. Does that seem right to you?
I think that's 100% right. We talk about in social science this concept of socioeconomic class. And, the idea there being that measuring class is very, very difficult. Education gets you some of the way there, but if you are a NYU dropout in Williamsburg as a barista, you have very different values than if you're a nurse who happens to might be classified as having an advanced degree. And so I think that when we look at education, that is a marker for culture. Something that's really hard is that there are other ways you can cut this too. You can look at social trust and trust in institutions, which I actually think is also highly correlated with education and is also honestly probably a class or a cultural marker. But then the spicier thing you can look at is something called racial resentment. Obviously that has a meaning in English, but in political science, it has like a particular meaning where you ask like a certain class of questions. In surveys, you can't just ask people, are you a racist? Though I think it'd be fun to try. I don't know how many people would say yes. But So, that the idea is you can't say that, but clearly, racism as an idea exists in some way. There are some people are more racist than others, in abstract. And so people ask these questions that, try to get at that. And so examples of this are asking people, how likely do you think it is that there are a lot of white people who are having trouble finding jobs because non-white people are getting them instead? Or do you think that white people have enough say in how the country is getting run? Or a more classical one is, do you think that discrimination is the reason why African Americans haven't been able to get ahead the same way that Italians and Jews and other disadvantaged groups have? I don't make up these. I don't make up this word. These aren't claims for me or questions I'm raising. These are just standard academic questions. And so if you create an index, of these, you ask a couple of these different questions and you average them. Something that really came out in 2016 was that if you statistically control for racial resentment, then education becomes totally uncorrelated. Low racial resentment, working class white people swung toward Democrats, and high racial resentment, college-educated white people swung toward Republicans. And so, that does capture a lot of the story. The only problem there is that a lot of critiques people will make of racial resentment as a concept is that racial resentment itself is kind of a class marker. Like if you're a highly educated person, you're taught, I'm not supposed to say, that Black people should bring themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever. You're like socialized against it. And so there are like, it's a really tricky thing that if you look at 2016, there are a bunch of different things. Another one is openness to new experiences. You talked about psychometric traits. Openness to new experiences seems like it was very highly correlated with swing against Trump. People who have very high levels of openness trended Democratic, and people with low levels of openness, trend Republican. Obama-Trump voters as a group were more low openness than any other vote combination. But again, that is something that's super correlated with education. And so it's this really annoying thing where you have all of these like similar but distinct things: openness to new experiences, racial resentment, education, socioeconomic class, trust in institutions, and they're all correlated with each other, and they're all clearly part of the same story, but it's very hard to disentangle exactly what caused what.
Yeah, I want to dwell for a moment on this notion of racial resentment. I've often wondered what exactly we're measuring when we ask someone a question like, or when you say, do you agree that Black people should work hard like every other group, so something like that. And I came across this paper by Riley Carney and Ryan Enos, I think Harvard researchers, where you may have seen this, where they substituted a random Eastern European group like Lithuanians in these racial resentment scales and substituted them in for African Americans, and found that they got basically the same responses from people of both parties. So people who would say Black people should work hard like everyone else were just as likely to say Lithuanians should work hard like everyone else. And what they surmise from this is that what alleged racial resentment scales are measuring is not properly shouldn't be seen as racial resentment, but rather some kind of deep instinct for procedural fairness and meritocracy. Have you come across that, or what do you think?
I haven't read that specific paper, but I do think I would push back against the claim. I do want to I do want to make clear, while I am sympathetic to a lot of these academic critiques that exist of racial resentment as a concept. I do, want to make clear that I think that, I don't want to. I feel bad saying this out loud, but I think racism clearly exists. I think some voters are more motivated by racially charged things than others. And I do think that racial resentment, even if it doesn't on an individual level capture everything, I think does is related, in a lot of ways. Like to talk, but I think that the paper you just brought up does really highlight some of the how a lot of this stuff works. I think that racial resentment is a lot less cartoonishly evil. It's more subtle and complicated than I think that a lot of liberals will give it credit for. And so one thing you could say in response to your paper is that without any context, it's totally true that a lot of conservatives will care a lot about procedural fairness for some random Lithuanian group, but there's a reason that conservatives and actually care a lot about procedural fairness relative to liberals, and I won't ascribe that entirely, but I think if you step back and you look at what areas of the country are high racial resentment and which areas are not, I don't think it's a coincidence that the white people with the highest levels of racial resentment live in the Deep South. Or if you map out racial resentment, I don't think it's surprising that it's areas where Trump did the most well, did the best in the primary, or that, on a geographic level, it's correlated with places where people make more, I think, clearly racist, search terms. And so, when they're Googling, racial slurs and stuff like that. So I do think that, this is a construct that's real. I do agree that it's more subtle than people give it credit for. But, I do think that racial resentment as a concept is important. I think it's I guess at a high level, I think it shouldn't be surprising in a lot of ways that if you have a situation where you have a candidate who campaigned on saying a bunch of racially inflammatory things early in his campaign, and then got a bunch of people who seemed to score highly on racial resentment questions to swing toward him, I think that racism has something to do with it, even if the word racist is hard to define and racism is hard to define. I don't want to get into a semantic fight, but I don't think it's true that all of these working class white people in northern Wisconsin trended against Democrats because they were inspired by Donald Trump's devotion to, fairness, procedural fairness. I don't think that's right.
So, I guess this would be a good time to segue into the, what seems to be, given everything you said, and I don't want to dwell on it for too long, but it is surprising that Donald Trump has gained a certain amount of traction in the Hispanic and Black electorate. If it is the case that his appeal is based on racism or partly based on racism, it's at minimum curious why that's the case. There has to be some way to, that should either diminish the notion that racism is his appeal, or else we need some more complicated theory that accounts for why his share of the, people of color is increasing. So what is given what you just said, can you first describe what we know, what is turning out to be true about how much his share of the minority vote is increasing, and how you square that circle?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I think if you just to go through the history, historically, the trend for really the last 40 years is that every single cycle, white people had been getting more conservative relative to the country overall, voting Republican at higher rates, while non-white people were getting more Democratic. That happened consistently every single election from 1988 to 2012. And 2016 was actually the first break, from this trend. It was, I think, one of the underappreciated aspects of that of the election. African American at the time, I think a lot of people wrote it off as Obama not being on the ballot anymore. But Donald Trump did, I think, something like 2 to 3% better among African Americans. And how well he did with Hispanics is something that people still argue about. But my impression, from what I can tell, is that at least in battleground states, he did slightly better with Hispanics than Romney. And I think that just stopping there and not flash forwarding to the next 4 years, I think that says something very interesting, that when about what racial resentment is and how people perceive it. When Donald Trump dialed up the racial resentment, what happened was that a bunch of college-educated white people with low levels of racial resentment moved to Democrats, and non-college educated white people with high levels of racial resentment moved to Republicans. But non-white, the non-white vote didn't move very much or swung a little bit against Trump. And I think that's something that liberals didn't expect. I think a lot of liberals were really hoping that kind of openly xenophobic, language would cause increases in Hispanic turnout. And I think it's clear, that didn't happen, and definitely not increases in support. So when you flash forward to 2018, you see this racial depolarization continue. White people, relative to 2016, swung something like 5 or 6% toward Democrats, and non-white people as a group, swung, I think, about a point or two against Democrats. And this was like a meaningful thing. Stacey Abrams would be a governor if she did as well with African Americans as Hillary Clinton did. And we lost the Florida Senate race because we improved ground with white voters, particularly rural white voters, but then lost ground with Hispanic and Black voters and ended up losing a very close race because of it. So that was pretty important. And then now we flash forward to 2020. In 2020, it seems like, again, the African-American vote has shifted toward Republicans, though it's unclear exactly by how much, but, probably something on the order of, 1 to 2%, while the Hispanic vote has swung tremendously toward Republicans. Polls did kind of see maybe a third of that coming, I think, going into it. Some people were expecting a 3 or 4 or 5% shift against, toward Republicans. But so far, county level results really indicate that there was a much larger swing. There are counties in there's a county in Texas where I think Zapata County that had voted for Democrats literally as long as it had existed for over 100 years. Clinton won it by 30 points, and it now, went to Trump. There are just these incredible swings in, most concentrated areas where there seem to be a lot of Hispanics. And it is, one of the major reasons we lost Florida was just our incredibly poor performance in Miami-Dade. And so there's still a lot we don't know about the nature of this Hispanic divide. It's something that we're going to have to wait until we get more precinct results for and voter file results for. But it does seem like in pretty broad swaths of the country, whether it's South Florida or South Texas or Houston or, large swaths of the Northeast in, Hispanic neighborhoods in Massachusetts, that there's been a pretty broad double-digit decline. It very easily could end up being as large as 14%. And that's seismic. It's one of the largest shifts in racial voting that's really happened in decades in one cycle. And so that's, I don't know. I think that's super interesting. And then at the same time, white voters trended toward Democrats. So in a lot of ways, Donald Trump has ended this multi-decade trend of racial polarization and, kind of reversed it. And I think that's something that I personally did not see coming going into this, but I think it's clear at this point that it's happening.
Yeah, nor did I. So there was I want to come back to that in a moment, but there was some initial polling result, I think that the day after the election, that suggested that the LGBT vote and the Muslim vote had also swung towards Trump a few percentage points or perhaps more. Do we know more about that now? Did that turn out to be robust?
It's not something I've looked into. So I don't want to comment too much. I think it's definitely true. When people talk about the Muslim vote, it's usually with regard, it's most Muslims in the U.S. Are Asian and actually, South Asian. And so there's a lot of evidence that that Vietnamese Americans swung pretty, had a pretty substantial swing toward Trump. Obviously, Trump campaigned in the South Asian community, though usually more with Hindus than Muslims. So, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't find it surprising either way.
So I want to come back to this notion of racial resentment in light of the minority vote trending towards Trump. because intuition as well as personal experience would suggest to me, if you were to give a quote unquote racial resentment scale to the median, Ghanaian or Nigerian immigrant or Central American immigrant or Vietnamese immigrant or Pakistani immigrant, that they would, you would see results very similar to, the quote unquote racially resentful white, non-college educated working class. And, this is not to say, how conditional on that being true. It seems to me there are a few things to observe. One is that, as you said, there's a never-ending semantic debate over what exactly something like racism means, which is, not useful ground here. But then there's the fact that it seems when I read about racial resentment in the media, it seems like it's framed in such a way that this is a uniquely a white, if not sin, then embarrassment, rather than, a multiracial human phenomenon that might not usefully be moralized, right? It might make sense to come up with some less morally charged language, or language that could not easily be interpreted as you're a racist for thinking that this group should play by the same rules, or so on and so forth. And it seems like we're less tempted to do that in cases where minorities have those same opinions. And I can see how a white person might feel, well, the finger's unfairly being pointed at me when my opinions or my instincts are shared by a lot of, minority voters as well. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to stress that it is definitely true. I think it's definitely true that a substantial fraction of non-white voters do hold, classically racial resentful language. Though it is, to be clear, like a lot on average, non-white voters have lower levels of racial resentment if you go and ask, which I think is unsurprising. I think, if you did it a different way, if you asked African Americans about their feelings toward Muslims, it's quite possible that they might be similar to working class white people. It's something, though
or Hispanics, right? Yeah, I know.
Yes.
Towards immigration, you often find nearly identical levels of anti-immigrant sentiment among blacks and whites, for instance.
Yeah, polarization cuts against that, but I think within party, that's 100% true. And look, I grew up in Miami, one of the most diverse places in the world, and I'm like fully aware of the fact that white people don't have a monopoly on ethnic chauvinism. It's in some ways, it's definitely not true at all. And I think it is true that a substantial fraction of non-white people do agree, with certain aspects of this worldview. What I think is really interesting is that historically, even among Democrats, African Americans had lower levels of racial liberalism, to use a different word, but related, views on these things than white Democrats. And what's really interesting is that after 2014, that changed. Matthew Iglesias talks about the Great Awakening, that there was this really massive, unprecedented increase in racial liberalism among white Democrats. And at this point, white Democrats have higher levels of racial liberalism under most measures than Black Democrats, and definitely than Hispanic Democrats. And that's really interesting. I think that once you live in a world, once you have a scale where white liberals are scoring higher than non-whites, then it does kind of raise some questions at the limits of what this stuff means and what the implications are for messaging. And I think that when you talk about why it is that non-white voters, just to go back to that, for a second, trended toward Trump. I want to be clear. I really mostly don't know. But I do think there are some really interesting facts about the world. One thing we asked people, I think sometime in 2017 or 2018, was we asked voters, do you think that Donald Trump is racist? And something that was pretty interesting is that when we talked to Black Trump voters, something like 30 to 40% of them actually did think that Donald Trump was racist. And I think that gets at, one, a lot of non-white people don't see the world as a, crusade or jihad against racism in the same way that white liberals do. That a lot of non-white people have had to live and work with racist white people their entire life, and the fact that there are racist white people in charge is less of a big deal on a day-to-day basis than a lot of white people might think. And I think it does show that racial liberalism has kind of become a cultural marker among whites, and I think that, or kind of a proxy for this, like within class or within culture divide between kind of higher socioeconomic whites and lower socioeconomic whites. And so I think as higher socioeconomic status educated white people have entered the Democratic Party, and lower education whites have left the party, they've they've become a larger share, and I think they've really taken over a lot of the party's messaging, a lot of the party's branding. And I think that culturally, to get at what you said with racial resentment, working class Black people and working class Hispanic people and working class white people culturally have a lot more in common across a wide range of issues, than they do with college educated white people. And so in a lot of ways, I think it should be unsurprising that as the salience of these cultural, as American politics has turned into this war between, high education whites and low education whites, that this has caused a little bit of racial depolarization. I don't think that's super surprising.
So I guess this is a good time to go to this notion of demography is destiny, which is a phrase that has been thrown around, probably a phrase that basically means, as the country, as the browning, the so-called browning of America occurs, where the share of the population becomes less white and more Hispanic and Asian and African American, that the Democratic Party will inevitably benefit from this trend, and the Republican Party will inevitably suffer. So this is a phrase that's been repeated quite a bit in the past 5 to 10 years, and celebrated on the left and feared on the right. So can you explain? This notion never really persuaded me, but because it seemed to just assume a static population. It assumes that the average Black voter and the average white voter is going to have the same beliefs today as they will in 30 years, which seems crazy given the history of population change. But what do we know about that notion now, given the 2020 result?
Well, I really like to tell the story of Florida. In 2000, Florida was basically tied. Obviously, it came out to a recount. And since then, population of Florida has doubled. The non-white share of the electorate has doubled. And yet Florida is actually 20 years later, Florida is more Republican than it was 20 years ago. I think at any point in history, in 2004, it would have been really easy to say, we lost older voters and we won younger voters. And so, in 15 years, we're going to win all these elections. And it's 15 years later. And clearly that hasn't happened. Clearly, there's a dialectic here. There are these countervailing forces. Just talk about in practice what those forces have ended up being. Even though younger people, have trended toward Democrats, at the same time, older people have trended toward Republicans. And actually, as the real shock, and the reason why we didn't win Florida this time was that non-white voters have trended Republican over the same period. So I think it really does go to show there's in political science, people talk about this concept of the median voter theorem, this idea that there are these countervailing forces and that parties should expect to get about 50% of the 50% of the vote over time. And I think that's right. And I think the other point is even there are a lot of demographic trends that should help Democrats in some ways. People are getting married much later than they used to. Birth rates are lower than they used to be. People are more secular. They're more educated, and these are all things now that are highly correlated with being Democrats. But at the same time, parties have shifted in response to those trends. Like the Democratic Party is substantially to the left of where it was 20 years ago. And maybe if the Democratic Party hadn't moved to the left and we were still running people like Al Gore, I don't know if it would be better, but maybe then we would have had more of a chance. But parties adapt to these things more than people realize.
Yeah, so the same. I've had the same skepticism for the same reason of the notion that simply getting rid of the Electoral College, which I think might be a good idea, would inevitably benefit Democrats as well in the medium or long run, because I'm not sure how, I can't predict how under a new set of incentives politicians and media would react and how voters would react to the knowledge that their vote now counts no matter where they live. So to me, it's a complete mystery how the Electoral College would affect things. Do you have more insight on that question?
I mean, I think that there are very real, deep structural biases that go way beyond the Electoral College. If you look at, the Senate, for example, in 2018, Democrats, won by, had a wave year. They won by, 8 points nationally, and they lost 2 Senate seats. The basic issue, with the Senate, and this really shows up in a bunch of other places, is that rural places are overrepresented at every single layer of our government. And so if you look at our state legislative maps, our congressional maps, our Senate maps, Democrats really would need to win by enormous amounts in order to win. And the Electoral College is a little less fundamental. It's kind of a fluke right now that the Electoral College bias is so large, though it got larger this time than 2016, and I think that it'll probably stay large for the rest of the decade. But there's nothing inherent. Its bias is a little bit more random. The Electoral College actually benefited Democrats somewhat in 2012. But I do think when you look at these biases, it is like a very hard. It is a real problem. I think it does very meaningfully influence how many elections you'd expect Democrats to win, and I think it's obviously unfair in a lot of ways. It mechanically works by disenfranchising people who live in cities who are disproportionately non-white. But it's interesting because in theory, it should be possible for no matter what electoral system you have, even if you had a system that didn't allow, that only let people in cities vote. Like in theory, some of the political scientists would tell you that no matter what your electoral system is or how unfair it is, it should be possible to chase the median voter, move your policies so that, you can win these people back. And I think a really interesting challenge is that I think now it's become very hard for parties to do that. I think, these college-educated white people, the American electoral system is really built so that college-educated white people can't have a coalition with, them. And, it's like really built against them in a lot of ways. And so as education polarization has increased, it's really disadvantaged Democrats. But these same voters, these same college-educated voters have a wildly disproportionate amount of influence within the Democratic Party. They donate at much higher rates, they volunteer at higher rates, they're more likely to run as candidates. And obviously they mechanically make up the staff who work at all of these organizations. And so getting them to have less power. It's very hard for a party that is really fundamentally run by highly educated young white people to pivot its branding to try to appeal more to older rural white people. And we're going to have to try, but it's very difficult.
you've talked in the past about the changing role of money in politics, or the changing political valence of super PAC money in politics. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we be clear. I'm a left-wing person. I think getting money out of politics would be a good idea, but I think it's worth being clear-eyed about what the current situation is, which is that right now in 2020, the Democrats outspent Republicans at almost every level of government. Maybe not state legislatures, but in the presidency, in the Senate, in the House, we generally outspent our opponents almost uniformly in all of our races. And that has two sources. One, the people who donate, the so-called small donors, tend to be overwhelmingly professionals, and professionals as a group have trended tremendously toward the left. If you go to 2012, I think small dollars or if you go back to 2010, small donors as a group, I think gave a slight majority of money to Republicans. But now, I don't know what the 2020 number was, but in 2018, that number was more like 72%. Super PACs, started to exist in 2010. Those are, unlimited spending by super rich people. And it used to be 70-30 or 80-20 toward Republicans. And 2018, I think, was the first year where super PACs spent more on Democrats than Republicans. And, the reason is that as education polarization has increased, the effects have been largest, with the highest educated and richest people. I'm sure that, we still lose billionaires as a group, or, super, super rich people as a group, but they're much more democratic than they used to be. And so structurally, we now live in this world where it's not, money in politics doesn't have an obvious partisan valence, or if it does, it's one that helps Democrats. And we also live in this world where if you look at how primary elections go, left-wing candidates, like Bernie or like Warren, were able to outraise moderate candidates like Biden. And the reason for that is that both of them have an electoral base of highly educated white people that donate a lot more than Biden's base of working class Black people and working class white people. And so I think this is creating a situation where I think the money in politics, to the extent to which it's a factor, is moving the Democratic Party to the left, and arguably making it harder for them to win elections as a result. Because campaigns are chasing this median donor as opposed to a median voter, and that's causing a lot of it's probably causing problems.
Okay, two more questions before I let you go. So one is about the net effect of the summer 2020 that will go down in history books. I'm speaking of the death of George Floyd in police custody, the protests that ensued, as well as the riots that ensued. So I've heard two countervailing trends that both seem persuasive. One is that the initial surge in support for Black Lives Matter, as the nation watched in horror as George Floyd died beneath the knee of Derek Chauvin, led to a huge upswing in support for registered voters for the Democratic Party, which had a positive effect for Biden on November 3rd. On the other hand, there's a trend of the nation watching in horror as cities burn and being driven towards the right as a result. So what do we know about the net effect of the racial, politics of the summer 2020 on the electorate?
That's a great question, and it's something that in some ways is hard to know. But I think if you look at the public polling trends, I think if you look at them properly, I think that you could tell a story that there are really only two things that happened in this race. This race was really incredibly stable. And the only two changes you really see were one, a surge in support after the Lafayette Park, incident where Donald Trump ordered, the police, the National Guard to clear out and tear gas innocent protesters in front of the church. And I think I can say I can really pinpoint that. I think if you look day by day, it's pretty clear that that was the event that made the polling go up. And then I think you can tell a story that toward the end of August, it's complicated a little bit by the presence of the RNC around the same time, but that some of the unrest in Milwaukee, led to a decline that, basically it was spread over, like a 2 or 3 week period, but basically completely undid, the 1% to 2% surge caused after Lafayette. Now that said, I think polling is very hard in retrospect. I think given that the polls seem to have been overestimating Biden, I think there's a case you could make that maybe liberals started answering the phone more after the Lafayette Park incident, or that they answered less after the unrest. So I don't know how much of those trends are real, though I suspect the answer is probably most, or at least some. But I think that those were really the only things that seemed to move polling. There was a little bit after the first debate, but really everything was incredibly stable other than those two things. And I think that tells you that the events were very powerful. In a lot of ways, they were the only things that mattered for the entire cycle, arguably more than COVID. So that's which econometrically seems to not have any relationship at all with presidential vote share. So I think that's really interesting, and I think it gets to how nonviolent. It's just that there's a lot of power in organizing, but also a lot of risk in not having sufficient, discipline. But like if you look not just at the horse race, if you look at issue polling, there's basically this story that immediately after the start of the protests, there were these very large increases in various measures of some measures of racial liberalism, but also a lot of measures about BLM favorability or attitudes toward the police. And, unfortunately, when people started polling it again at the end of the summer, a lot of those gains had evaporated. And so it does show, though I think not all the way down to where it was before. So it does show that, nonviolent protests can be extremely effective. And there's, I think, a lot of great academic evidence in that favor, but also that property destruction and all of that can be incredibly electorally damaging. And so there's like a lot of risk.
Yeah. Okay. So last question. This question is about how to evaluate Trump. What the success of Trump, the surprising success, not only in 2016, but to some extent in 2020, says about the future of Trumpism. And I think there's a tendency to want, and I have noticed this in myself as well, a tendency to want Trump to be a fluke and a desire to just get a John McCain or Mitt Romney type Republican next time, just from the interest of a person who thinks Trump's personality has made him a dangerous and unfit president. So the question is, given the fact that Biden did not crush Trump as was expected, and as I would hope should have been easy given Trump's unusual flaws, it may just be worth reimagining his flaws as not liabilities, but as assets. I have to imagine that Republican presidential hopefuls, the lesson they're taking away from the past 4 years is not everything Trump did is a mistake and we should go back to the Republican status quo. It has to be something more like Trump's presidency for Republicans represents a half success where, all the ways in which he departed from the norms of the Republican Party and, did everything possible to piss off half the country a lot of that actually might point a direction in a direction of success for the Republican Party, and they might just see, 3 or 4 of Trump's character flaws and his mismanagement of COVID as the things to avoid. So, the mold for them might be Trump minus the narcissism and perhaps minus the 5 worst scandals. So basically my question is, do you expect that we are going to be dealing with Trumpism out of the Republican Party as a direction, or with a reversion to the status quo?
I would say predictions about the future are hard, but I do think it's important to recognize what Trumpism is. I think that people really focus on there's a lot of psychoanalysis of Donald Trump that people do. They say, people really want a strong, male leader. They really like that he was on The Apprentice. But I think, if you step back, every single country in the West right now, whether it's France or Britain or, Italy or Germany, all of them have seen this phenomena of anti-immigrant populists coming out, promising not to talk a ton about economic issues, and then gathering and kind of having incoherent stances on economic issues, and then gathering this base of working class people who used to vote for the left at high numbers. This has happened basically in almost every Western European country, in Europe, and so there's something really fundamental here. And if you look at who the leaders of these people are, they're not all like Trump. Marine Le Pen is not like Trump. The head of the AFD is, they're all pretty different. And so I think the personality aspects to why this coalition exists are not, are not essential. But what is kind of there is really culturally being cruder, trying to appeal to having these working class appeals, talking about being, pretty stridently anti-immigrant, trying to dial up racial resentment, whatever you decide that word means. And the only difference is that it wasn't successful in these other countries because they have a different electoral system. But in our electoral system, we very heavily overweight the views of non-college educated white people. And so I suspect, the GOP was rewarded from the Trump era by large, very almost semi-permanent majorities at every single level: state legislative, congressional, Senate, and also a world, an electoral college world where they can win with 48.5% of the vote. And so that's pretty good. I think that's going to be very tempting. And so I think that's the problem, is that, due to the nature of our electoral system, the Republican Party really has a very strong incentive to continue along this model. Something I like to do, just to talk about numbers, is Barack Obama in 2012 got 52.0% of the two-party vote. And Hillary Clinton got 51.1%. And if in any other country, if you, went from 52 to 51.1, it would be fine. It wouldn't really mean anything. But what happened at the same time is that the bias of the Electoral College went from being half a point, biased toward Democrats, to being like 3 or 4 points biased toward Republicans. And the reason that happened is that all of these swing states had a lot of non-college whites who, this strategy really appeals to. And, that's true along racial resentment, authoritarianism. All of these things are heavily correlated with class. And so, that's why he was able to win, was because this coalition has so much more power. It wasn't about actually bringing in more voters. It was about changing, the nature of the coalition. And that's going to be super tempting. If I was a political party, I would, I wish that my political party could win with 48% of the vote. Everything would be very different. And so I think it's going to be very hard for them to change. And that's even just from a strategic perspective. I think, if you look at the nuts and bolts, Republican primary voters, are going to try very hard to punish. So I personally don't think Trumpism is going anywhere, which I think is scary. And I think that the only long-term solution, to fighting Trumpism is to fight the reason why it works by trying to get non-college white people to split their votes more. We basically, it's awkward to say, and I just want to go way back to, we were talking about racial resentment, is that there are a lot of white people with relatively high levels of racial resentment. And there are so many of them that it's impossible to win elections without getting a certain fraction of their votes. And realistically, Trumpism is going to exist as long as 80% of those people are voting for Republicans. If we don't return to the 2012 Obama era status quo of 60% of those people voting for Democrats, then we're just going to keep having the same problem again and again and again. And this time, luckily Donald Trump is super narcissistic and personally unlikable in a lot of ways, and so we were able to eke out a win. But next time we won't be so lucky, and so it's really imperative that we do what we can to win these voters back.
Yeah, it occurs to me when you said, these things, racial resentment and authoritarianism and all of these other things are correlated with class. It occurs to me there's a problem, a universal problem of social bubbles, but there's a problem when the class that is labeling all these things, deciding what to call these, is the higher class, right? Like
right.
It's up to people like me or whomever who went to the Ivy League to label what that scale means and to moralize it in however way it makes sense to me based on my upbringing in sunny liberal Montclair, New Jersey, and then that may look differently to other people. And of course, it's at some level it's impossible to correct for one social bubble perfectly, but I think if there is one, I'm sort of shooting from the hip here, but if there was one piece of advice for Democrats to beat Trumpism in the future, it's to be very aware of how one's existence in an elite bubble influences the messages that one finds compelling in a way that puts one out of touch with what the people you have to win over and who are winnable are going to find compelling. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. It's just a very hard thing to correct. That's something that we've seen in our tests. We actually, my old firm, we tested a lot of ads. One of the things that was really clear was the more people in the office liked the ad, kind of the worse it did a lot of the time. My favorite example is, Hillary in the 2016 campaign, there was this thing called the Mirrors ad. It's one of the most shared ad of the campaign. And there's this, this little girl, and she's in front of a mirror, and then Donald Trump is saying all these really horrible things, and the girl starts crying. That's like, that's kind of the ad. And it turned out that actually cost us votes in large swaths in the Midwest. We spent millions of dollars on it, but there really were, I personally, I'm a liberal, I like the ad. But there were a lot of working class white people who are like, Donald Trump is talking to me about real issues that matter, and you are trying to guilt trip me about some politically incorrect jokes that Donald Trump made, and I don't care. And so even though, there's like a real issue, which is that the people who run Democratic campaigns, and I'm in this bucket, have like really very different values than a lot of swing voters. And so that's why I think it's just super important to be clear-headed and do your best to, have good measurement, and also to try to have more representation in a lot of concrete ways. The people, right now, within the Democratic Party, highly educated people have an enormous amount of power, and that's obvious. Highly educated people always run everything. That is actually how the world works. But everything we can do to dial that down will make us better at winning elections.
So on that note, David, thank you so much for your time. And can you point people in the direction of the work you're doing now, to your Twitter profile or website if you have one?
Yeah, I am David Shor on Twitter. Last name is Shor, David Shor. And I have I have a lot of fun professional stuff coming up, and I'll be announcing it there. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure.
All right, take care.
All right.